Hello, this is Lisa Huning of The Shifting Path, and I would like to welcome you to What I Wish I Knew. In this audio series, I am talking to people who have been or are in a caregiving role for their family member. My guest is Christina Festa. She will be sharing with us her experiences with managing medications when her mother had an unexpected hospital stay. Welcome, Chris, and thank you so much for being here to share what you wish you knew.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
So please tell me about your experience.
Well, when you talk in terms of medication management, it's a pretty broad term, and the way we first were introduced to it was, getting a wallet card from a doctor saying, here's a good place to keep track of all your medications, and to bring it back each time you went to the doctor so that they could update their records. But a wallet card is a good start, but it really isn't enough, especially when you're about to enter a hospital setting.
How so?
Well, the typical wallet card has columns on it to enter the name of the medication, the dosage, and the frequency, and that's basically it. For most people, that may be enough, but as we age, the number of prescriptions we take tends to increase, and you might have more than one for the same condition, and that starts to pose a challenge in figuring out how to best take the medication so they have the maximum effectiveness without unintentional interactions between the prescriptions.
So what did you find was additional information that needed to be included in that medication record that we keep and also share with providers?
Well, I think the thing that was most important was we had, over time, worked out a schedule. So the doctor and my mother worked together to figure out when the best time was for her to be taking the medication so that they didn't conflict. And that information needed to be shared with other doctors, but when being admitted to a hospital, either for a procedure or via the emergency room, they really need to understand if you have a personalized dosing schedule and that it should be followed, especially if it deviates from the generic instructions that typically come on the side of the bottle.
And so why would you want to deviate from the instructions on the side of the bottle?
Well, what you have to remember is that the instructions on the side apply to one medication, and that's as if it were being used in a vacuum. If you have several doctors prescribing medications for different things, they may not be familiar with how their prescription can interact with another. And in my mother's case, her cardiologist prescribed two medications that were supposed to work in tandem. And while they had different functions, both also had the effect of lowering her blood pressure.
So the effect of the medications working together really needs to be taken into consideration. And so you'd figured out a schedule, but when you got to the hospital setting, what happened?
Well, my mother was scheduled to have a pacemaker put in, and normally as part of the pre-op process, you're asked to bring in all the patient's prescription bottles so a nurse can review the medication, the strength, and the dosing instructions. And then the pre-op nurse enters that information into their computer system so the hospital can confirm that they actually have those medications in their inventory and that the nurses will know what to administer when during your stay. And I thought we'd done one better than bringing in the bottles because we brought this list that we always took to the doctor's appointments, and it had the notes on it of the schedule the doctor had worked out with my mother. So we knew when best to take them. Well, when I handed over the list to the nurse, she actually thanked me for making her life easier by having the information already written out. But this is where the what I wish I knew lesson occurred.
What was that?
That was to insist that the list of medications be entered exactly as we've provided them, and especially the times that the medication should be given when that differs from the generic statement on the side of the bottle.
And what did you find out as to why that was so important?
Well, I learned a few of the hospital protocols that day that, are not typically known, and they really have an effect. And the first was that the computer system that manages the medication in a hospital can have a mind of its own. And second, that you can get the staff to enter the information as you stipulated up front, but once that information is in the computer, if there's a mistake in how it was entered, a nurse cannot correct it without first paging a doctor on call to get a new order to fix it. And getting that response can be as difficult as pulling teeth.
And you'd think that that would be a pretty minor issue.
Well, yeah, you would, but, a minor oversight can have major consequences, right? And in my mother's case, the pre-op nurse only entered the names of the medications and their dosages. She didn't enter the dosing schedule we'd worked out with the cardiologist. So the computer registered the first medication, which was called Carvedilol, and she was supposed to get a 20 milligram tablet twice a day. The computer then assigned default times for administering the doses, and the times that it assigned were based on the hospital schedule, not based on my mother's schedule. So because the prescription had to be given with food, the default times it assigned were 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., which is when they serve breakfast and dinner. Well, that's 9 hours apart. My mother was taking it 12 hours apart. The second medication she had, the one that the cardiologist had said, take at 3 p.m. so that it was spaced out with between the other two, that was a once-a-day dose. The default time the computer assigned for a once-daily dose was 10 a.m. So I discovered this odd scheduling when I was reviewing the medications in the computer with the bedside nurse later that night after my mom made it out of surgery and was moved up to the cardiac ward. And when I pointed out this discrepancy in the scheduling, the nurse promised to page the on-call doctor to get a change order. So I went home thinking the issue was taken care of, but it wasn't.
So the hospital dosing schedule wasn't corrected, and it was no longer an easy fix. How did that affect your mom?
Well, unforeseen circumstances also intervened to exacerbate the whole issue, and that's part of the problem is that several minor issues can cascade. And in this case, first thing the next morning, my mother was sent down for an x-ray and didn't return to her room until after 9 a.m., and so the RN on duty brought her breakfast at 9 a.m. and at that time gave my mother all of her morning medications at once, the ones that were supposed to be taken with food, the ones that were supposed to be taken once a day. So instead of taking her 2 heart medications 6 hours apart, she was given both at the same time.
Oh, no.
Yes. And what proceeded to happen was her blood pressure plummeted. A normal blood pressure is supposed to be about 120 over 80. Hers dropped to 79 over 50, and she became very lightheaded. So fortunately, the staff checked her blood pressure before having her stand up and try to move because she was scheduled to be discharged that day, so they already had a physical therapist in there getting her up and moving her around. Well, they fortunately checked the blood pressure first because, we needed to figure out what was wrong, and I needed to fight to keep her in there until we could figure it out. But if she had stood up without having it checked first, she could have face planted. And I was concerned that, once we realized that this blood pressure was way too low, that, if they discharged her, I'd get her home and she'd stand up too quickly and fall and break a hip and be right back in the hospital.
Right. So how did you get this all figured out?
Well, my mother's normally very sharp, but between having heart surgery and the medication mix-up, she was in no position to fend for herself. So that became my role, and I was polite, but I was persistent. And I asked questions to all the medical staff I could find, doctors, nurses, whomever, and reviewed her computer records with the nurse. And together we were able to track back and see the dosing schedule and tie that to her, what her blood pressure was when they did her vitals, and follow the thread and figure out what happened. But by then, my mother had received her evening dose of medication, which now was 7 hours after the first dose, the first 2 doses. And so her blood pressure stayed below the acceptable threshold for discharge, and was able to convince them to keep her in overnight again. And they were able to monitor her more closely than I could have, and they were able to confirm that the issue was the dosing schedule before she was released the next morning. And we know for sure now that this was the issue because my mother's resumed taking her medications on the schedule she and her doctor worked out, and we've had no repeat episodes.
Wow, that was a really close call. I'm so glad that it worked out in the end. So how would you summarize your experience to help other caregivers who might have a loved one who is admitted to the hospital?
Well, I think the most critical thing is to have a current list of medications for your patient, but be sure that it includes any instructions that deviate from the generic stuff written on the side of the prescription bottle, especially any scheduling specifics. And second, insist that the information that you provided be entered exactly as you stipulated it, and confirm that the hospital can adhere to the specific directions. And then finally, once they've entered it, review the information with the nurse before it gets saved into the system so that you can still make corrections where necessary up front and not have to fight to get additional authorizations later.
This is wonderful insight, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing what you wish that you knew as you entered into the situation with your mom in the hospital. I appreciate you sharing it with us today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.